Good evening, and thanks for joining us for Special Report Online. I'm Brett Barron, Washington. If this is your first time aboard, welcome. It's a different forum. Continue the conversation a little bit more relaxed. We want to hear from you. Weigh in, type in, ask questions, make comments, and don't worry if you don't see them right away. The producers are getting them in as fast as they can. We've got our panel still here, Steve, Laura, Tom, and Charles. One of the things we didn't talk about was the hearing today with the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jeh Johnson, testifying about Russian interference in the 2016 election. Take a listen.
In 2016, the Russian government, at the direction of Vladimir Putin himself, orchestrated cyber attacks on our nation for the purpose of influencing our election. I think it was unprecedented, the scale and the scope of what we saw them doing. I know of no evidence that through cyber intrusions, votes were altered or suppressed in some way.
Russia has a history of cyber attacks against our country. Is that true?
Yes.
In the parlance of our former jobs, Russia would be considered a career offender as it comes to seeking to undermine the foundations of our republic. They are constantly trying to attack the foundations and firmament of our republic. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair statement.
Secretary Johnson today and Trey Gowdy there. Laura, a couple of points. One is they said 21 states. There were efforts to scan those states, undermine or try to undermine the election. No votes changed. Again, we heard that from Comey. We heard that from Johnson. And that Russia has done this really for many, many years.
None of this surprises me. I mean, they're still pretty close to their old Soviet roots. The KGB building is still as ominous as it was 20, 30 years ago when I was a student in Leningrad. This, I think, is a bit of a wake-up call to us, though, that we better hire the best and brightest in the cyber warfare game, because they will continue to get better. Maybe they didn't change votes this time around, but they and China and Iran and other countries, I mean, this is what they want to do. And I don't know what we do with other countries' elections. I know we have preferred candidates at any given point in time. But look, we have our people on their streets and in their countries when they have their elections, and we have our own favored victor.
Let alone other countries and other elections. We know that they were active in Europe. Russia was. Serious concern. But when you jump the line to the collusion and the specifics, it kind of gets pretty murky.
It does, and I mean, finally, we had a hearing on substance, and we learned more about what actually took place, as opposed to the sort of, public kabuki stuff that went on with James Comey and Jeff Sessions and all of the sort of innuendo and allegations about collusion and obstruction. This was serious stuff. I think we are right to take it seriously. Russia was characterized during this hearing as being sort of a thief that was casing the neighborhood and wiggling on doorknobs to see what was open. They were more aggressive this time than they had been in the past, and I think that is a wake-up call for us. We better get our act together, because we know they're going to be doing it in future elections, 2018, 2020, and we need to be prepared.
It was Sean Spicer's answer at the briefing that really got some lawmakers' craw when he said that he didn't know whether the president agreed that Russia had tried to interfere in the 2016 election. He hadn't asked him that question, and it was like hours and hours of focus on that question. What about all this? When does this come to conclusion?
Well, this is the United States chasing its tail. Who cares whether the president agrees or not? The only reason that the Democrats are interested in this is not because they worry about the structure of our democracy. If this weren't about Trump, they wouldn't give a damn. If it weren't a way to delegitimize his election, we wouldn't have this. This is all about the search for collusion, which up until now there is zero evidence for. And in the absence of that, they're now going to create other issues, obstruction. But how do you obstruct something if there's no underlying crime? This is all about looking to go after Trump the same way in these special elections. The whole idea of running the table to win the House is to, as I said a little earlier, is to begin impeachment. This is all about that. And the Democrats are making a huge mistake. The country, it's true the president has low approval ratings. true that the majority did not vote for him in the general election. But it is not true that people want to see a constitutional crisis, or that our entire political debate and discussion, dialogue, is about the president and what he said, whether he believes the Russians intervened or not. So what? And that's the lesson, I think, from the by-election yesterday, which is the Democrats don't know what to talk about, do not have a message, do not have an agenda except for the far left, and that's all they want to do is to bring down the president. That's not going to work, and they've been shown it's not going to work, but they appear to persist in this.
Steve, what about the agenda? Now, I mean, you have Democrats like Murphy and Crowley and others actually today saying, Seth Moulton tweeting last night that it's time to move on. It's time to, you can walk and chew gum at the same time, but you got to get creative ideas about how to solve things.
Yeah, let me just real briefly on the hearing before I answer your question directly. The eyebrow raiser for me was Jay Johnson saying Vladimir Putin himself had ordered this. And that's the kind of thing that if he were still Secretary of Homeland Security, he would have had to have cleared by the CIA and other agencies in order to say that in public. Was he freelancing and speculating, or did he divulge classified information in that hearing? I do know that when John Brennan testified about these issues, there were eyebrows raised at the Director of National Intelligence, CIA, and elsewhere about the classified information that he shared by way of discussing these issues. So I'm very interested to see what we learn more about that claim from Jay Johnson. Not a small matter. On the question of the agenda, I mean, as Tom pointed out in the broadcast show, you have this call from many Democrats saying now the answer is really to move left. John Ossoff was too much of a centrist. He sort of was anti-Trump early, and then decided to focus on Georgia issues and talked about being a pragmatist and levels of spending. But really the answer is to become more strident and more left-wing. There are places that can work. I mean, there are gerrymandered districts, that Democrats probably should win, where that might be effective. But that is not an effective strategy if you're talking about winning some of the kinds of toss-up districts that we're looking at in the 28 midterms. And I would just go beyond that on the question of President Trump and whether he's going to be a big issue. I mean, on the one hand, Democrats need to lay out an agenda. They can't just say, we don't like Donald Trump, so vote for Democrats. On the other hand, Republicans learned in 2010 and 2014 that being a strong opposition and taking on a president can take you pretty far.
Laura, there's talk that some Democrats are reaching out to the White House about tax reform, for instance. Some talks behind the scenes with some Democrats about various elements. Is that fruitful?
I think in the midterms it might be, in some districts, every man for himself. I mean, they got to preserve their seats. And again, if the Republicans actually unite and get this agenda, the health care and the tax cuts through, it puts an enormous amount of pressure on the Democrats. It just does. I mean, they can just keep, banging at the moon and resisting and resisting and resisting. But if things get passed that start to make the lives of average Americans, everyday people better, their premiums maybe start edging down a little bit, that's real progress. And I don't see that the Democrats in places like Georgia and Kentucky and other places and Ohio are going to be able to go back to the voters and say, see, I was pushing for Obama's old agenda, that same agenda that delivered us, 0.4% GDP. I mean, they tried a lot of this stuff. It didn't work. I don't know what else they're going to try. I guess single payer, that's going to be their new thing, or raising taxes. I just don't think there's a lot of energy behind that, outside of the college campus setting, or maybe, some of the marches at Hollywood. But I just don't think it's all that popular.
A lot of people are asking whether you are considering White House press secretary.
Oh, I talked about this on Fox and Friends. It's not really my dream job to be press secretary. It never has been. I would help if I really thought I could make a big difference, but I think my talents would be a little bit beyond press secretary. That's my sense, but who knows.
A couple other people asking Tom about this hearing. Gidget says, I loved the long pause Jay Johnson had after being asked why the Obama administration did not bring up the Russia intervention during that time. Telling, she says.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, that's part of this story as well, right? Which is that that the Obama administration was basically silent. Now they said they didn't want to be seen as injecting themselves into this hard-fought election and all of that, but that is part of this story as well. The Obama administration, and remember, a lot of this stuff was taking place before Trump was even the nominee of the party, right? It was taking place in 2015 into 2016 when he was still battling it out among Republicans. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all that, because all this stuff is eventually going to come out.
If the anti-Trump fervor was so strong, you would think in a district like suburban Atlanta that couldn't be characterized as rural nowhere, that the educated population of suburban Atlanta would somehow be on this train.
That's the lesson of last night. Any Trump will work in college campuses, in Sanders rallies, in many precincts in the country. But generally speaking, it's not enough. Yes, it's energizing Democrats. Yes, it sort of underlies a lot. People are still wary. They're worried. But it is not enough. Nancy Pelosi, as I said in the broadcast show, she said we need a message. I don't think she's even aware of the fact that they have none. And they're going to have to find, I think, this is where the Democrats were in the late 80s, when they found a Bill Clinton who actually was able to cobble together a program, an ideology, a kind of a centrist, left-of-center political philosophy that was appealing and that he enacted in many ways. I think in the absence of that, these guys are going to wander in the wilderness. They're going to make some gains. I think Steve pointed out you can make, as happened in 2010, you can make some gains. But remember, in 2010, that was a rebellion against a hard left push by a hard left president and Obamacare, which sort of infected the entire debate. And that, I think, was so far against the grain of American mainstream that that was a reaction that makes sense. The reaction against Trump is not ideological. It's kind of personal. People worry. They're not too pleased with the way he conducts himself. But I think it's of a different variety, and I don't think that translates in congressional elections.
Charlotte Lady Steve says the Obama administration kept hush on the Russians because they thought Hillary was going to win. They didn't want to shade the validity of her election. When Trump ended up winning, they started announcing.
And the fact is that the Obama people and the Democrats have never cared about the Russians. Doesn't anybody remember him whispering, tell Vladimir that after the campaign I'll be able to be more flexible? The reset, their whole policy was abject appeasement of the Russians from beginning to end, including an arms control agreement that everybody overlooked. That was a giveaway. So why would they be? Yes, they'd be upset to some extent, but it became an issue as a result of the outcome of the election. Otherwise, it was not something that Democrats cared about.
It would take about 5 minutes for you to work up, if you laid out all of the Clinton folks and their connections to Russia, to gin up, the idea that...
I mean, who doesn't speak to the Russian ambassador? They got great caviar at their reception.
Let alone all the special deals that we talked about with the Clinton folks. Jake the Goose, frequent watcher online. Brett, keep taking time to travel. The more you come out here into the real world, the more you will understand the cesspool D.C. is. Steve, is there such a disconnect that actually the president should be able to push all this stuff through? Is that, steamroller something that is learned from last night, at least, or a glimpse of it?
Well, I think I would argue that it's more something that was learned from November of 2016 than last night. I mean, each of these special elections is sort of different or unique in its own way. Right, exactly. But there had been a disconnect between Washington and much of the rest of the country before 2016, but especially manifested itself in 2016. But we've seen previous iterations of this, whether we're talking about the Tea Party or what have you. I do think, that Republicans have to be careful about being sort of cocky about this. The president, as I said in the broadcast shows, 37% approval. That's not good. Like, it's not. Historically, that's not good. If Republicans go into the 28 midterms with President Trump at that level, and if they're not able to do the kinds of things that Laura suggests, if they're not able to get an Obamacare repeal and replace, however much Republicans don't like it, through if they're not able to do tax reform, if they don't do infrastructure, maybe if they do infrastructure. You know, there are all of these things that we know about that are on the agenda that Republicans have to do or have to give candidates something to campaign on. If candidates are going into the 28 midterms with a president, let's say he's at 40 or 45 even, and they can't point back to things that have been accomplished beyond what he's already accomplished in his first 130, 40 days, it's going to be hard.
Here's Mark Meadows of the Freedom Caucus in the House side.
In the next 7 weeks, we will put something on the president's desk to make sure that we repeal and replace Obamacare. We're laser focused on that, on tax reform, on making sure that we build the wall on our southern border. We're going to help him accomplish that. So I would suggest any people who are saying that we're not going to get it done are not really listening to the reality here on Capitol Hill.
Laura?
Well, I like Mark Meadows, but the fact of the matter is people are impatient. I think they have a right to be. They've seen their standard of living decline, flatline, for really almost 2 decades plus, and that Republicans kept saying they want both houses of Congress, they need the presidency, it wasn't just one house, needed it all, and they got it all, and they really stumbled out of the gate. So that's a nice spin, but people are really anxious for results and anxious to know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. They want an optimistic approach to governance as much as possible, because there's a lot of big challenges on the foreign policy front, and they want to see that when Donald Trump comes into office, things are going to be different.
I mean, let's be honest, Tom. First of all, the money will start to disappear quickly if Republicans can't get anything across the finish line. 2, if Democrats weren't as bad as they are on messaging, Republicans would be in a world of hurt about not getting things accomplished. Now, the president can list all the executive orders and obviously can point to the Supreme Court and Neil Gorsuch, and there'll be a whole bunch of people in the country that say that's good enough for me. Right. But there's a lot of people and businesses on tax reform, on health care, on infrastructure who say, I have to see the money.
Right. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, Democrats are opposing all of those things, right? So will they suffer for that? And conversely, if Republicans don't get this stuff done, they may suffer when they go back to their constituents and say, sorry, we couldn't repeal Obamacare. Really? After, 7 years, and you finally have control of all 3 branches, all 3 chambers?
Well, let me interrupt you. How does that turn? Do some Republicans up on the Senate side say, you know what, if we just don't have the votes, don't Democrats have to own this come Election Day, and it's Obamacare? And I asked numerous senators, you guys have control of the House, the Senate, the White House. Right. How can you not fix it? And there is some thought up there about, well, Democrats would own Obamacare.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't necessarily.
But I mean, there is. You've heard that, right?
There are 2 schools of thought, right? I mean, last time I was here, Senator Thune, you asked him, and he said, "Look, we've got to pass this, or it's going to be cataclysmic for us at the polls." I think that's the majority thinking on the Hill among Republicans, but certainly there are some, and some who have done a little bit of double dealing, I think, or who wouldn't be necessarily sad to see this thing die. And those are senators from some of the states that are getting some of this Medicaid money that they feel like if that Medicaid money goes away, then they're going to suffer for that. So a couple different competing agendas there. But I got to tell you, I mean, I get up and read through newspapers as my job every morning, hours and hours all across the country, and not a day goes by that I don't see a story about Trump supporters in Ohio, in places like Minnesota and Iowa, all over the country, who say, you know what, he's trying his best.
Well, he's more popular than Congress, Tom,
right.
Isn't he? He's more popular than this Congress, which is at about 18% last time I checked.
The
is that
plague
right?
is more popular than
but Trump should use the leverage against Congress. He's got to run against Congress at some point if they don't do their jobs.
But what does that do in terms of passing a legislative agenda?
It keeps him popular, and it keeps the Republicans who are on with his agenda popular in their districts. For the others, it might have light a fire under them.
They're going to get. This is the problem. I mean, this is what happened when Republicans had that sort of feint when they tried to pass the reform in the House the first time and then had to pull it back, and the president then tweeted, well, okay, I'll just go work with Democrats. What you had then was Republicans on Capitol Hill say, well, geez, how could he possibly say that? What we want is the opposite of what Democrats want. Democrats, by and large, want single payer. What we want to do is move the system to a more market-based system, however incrementally, however flawed.
On that point. I mean, that's just
but those words matter. I mean, what he says actually really matters, because then they think, do I want to walk out on a limb for this guy if he's...
Well, they're walking out on a limb because they promised they would do it to the voters, I think.
Quickly.
Yeah, the one thing I will say is what's interesting about this is if Democrats, if the fever breaks a little bit, you have these senators in red states, Democrats who are up for re-election, right? The thinking was always they'd have to compromise, they'd have to work with Republicans. They have not. They haven't felt any pressure on any of these issues. But
you're starting to hear echoes of it.
You're starting to hear echoes of it, and if the voters in their states, especially the Trump supporters, start taking them to task for being totally obstructionists across the board, then maybe you might start to see some of those folks break loose and be forced to deal with the Republicans on some of these issues.
Dr. Krauthammer, final word. Is there a lawmaker acetaminophen to break the fever up there?
No. No, this is Trump derangement syndrome. I discovered it, but I can't cure it. It is incurable. Shock therapy might be worth trying. And I'm not sure it would work. Look, but for Republicans, health care, one way or the other, is a losing proposition. They own the health care system the minute they come into power. There's no way to say it was Obama. It's not Obama, it's you. It's like with the economy. It's your economy. So I think you pass something, you hope for the best, but where the money is, where the payoff is, tax reform and tax cuts. Everything will depend next year on what's happened with the economy. If it's expanding, growing, it'll be a great day for Republicans. If it's not, then all of these issues will pile up on them.
Panel, as always, thank you. Special Report Online. We try to do it every Wednesday. Glad to have you aboard. Control room, a little goodbye.